The German gunner's hands were steady as he centered the crosshairs on the lumbering British tank crawling across the French countryside. May 1940. The Wehrmacht had been steamrolling through France for 11 days, crushing everything in its path. Another Allied tank wasn't going to change that. He squeezed the trigger. The 37mm armor-piercing round screamed towards its target at over 760 meters per second. Then it bounced off. Not penetrated and failed. Bounced. The shell ricocheted skyward like a stone skipping across water, leaving nothing but a bright scar on the tank's hull. The British tank didn't even slow down. It kept grinding forward at its painfully slow 11 kilometers per hour, turret rotating with methodical precision towards the German position. The gunner fired again and again. Same result. Bright flashes, metallic clangs, shells spinning off into the French soil. His loader was feeding rounds as fast as humanly possible now, brass casings piling up around their boots. Nothing. The Matilda II, because that's what the British called this mobile fortress, absorbed everything they threw at it. Its 78mm frontal armor might as well have been made of some alien metal for all the good their standard anti-tank weapons were doing. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Panzer crews had spent the past week and a half laughing at British and French tanks. They'd knocked out Char B-1s, shredded through Somuas, turned Hotchkiss light tanks into burning scrap. The Panzerkampfwagen III and I-4 had proven themselves the masters of armored warfare. German tactical doctrine, German training, German engineering, all superior. The French campaign had been a victory lap, really, a demonstration of what modern mechanized warfare looked like when executed by professionals. But nobody had told them about these particular British tanks. Intelligence reports had mentioned Matildas, sure, but the descriptions were almost dismissive, slow, undergunned. The British infantry tank concept seemed absurdly outdated. Who designs a tank that can barely outpace a jogging soldier? The name itself sounded like a joke. Matilda. Like a plump housewife, not a weapon of war. Some German crews had actually nicknamed them cardboard tanks, based on early reconnaissance reports, assuming anything that's slow must be poorly armored to keep the weight down. The gunner was no longer steady. Panic crept into his movements as the Matilda's 2-pounder gun swung in his direction. Around him, other crews were experiencing the same horrifying revelation. Their 37mm PaK 36 anti-tank guns, the standard, supposedly reliable tank killer of the Wehrmacht, were useless. Completely, utterly useless. They might as well have been throwing rocks. The mathematical reality was brutal. Their shells delivered roughly 40 millimeters of penetration at best. The Matilda's armor was nearly double that thickness. Simple arithmetic, but arithmetic that could get you killed. What the German crews didn't know, what nobody outside a few British military circles knew, was that they were facing the most heavily armored tank in the world at that moment. Not just thick armor, but properly designed, well-angled protection that had been the product of hard lessons and careful engineering. The Matilda II's armor scheme wasn't an accident or oversight. It was deliberate, intentional. The British had built a tank specifically to laugh at the kind of weapons now hammering uselessly against its hide. And as that realization spread through the German positions near Arras, something shifted. The invincible Wehrmacht, the unstoppable Blitzkrieg, had just met something it couldn't stop. To understand how the British ended up building a tank that could shrug off German fire, we need to rewind 2 decades, November 1918. The Great War had just ended, and military theorists across Europe were trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Tanks had made their debut at the Somme in September 1916, lumbering, mechanical monsters that terrified German infantry but broke down almost as often as they broke through. By war's end, they'd proven themselves capable of cracking trench lines, but nobody quite agreed on what they'd actually proven. The debate that followed would shape the next war entirely. Were tanks breakthrough weapons meant to exploit gaps and race into enemy rear areas? Or were they mobile bunkers designed to shield infantry as they advanced across killing fields? Two schools of thought emerged, and Britain, somewhat uniquely, decided the answer was both. J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, two of Britain's most influential military theorists, championed fast, ranging armored formations. They'd seen how tanks could restore mobility to warfare, how properly deployed armor could bypass strong points and create chaos in enemy logistics. Fuller's Plan 1919, never executed because the war ended, envisioned masses of medium tanks driving deep into German territory, paralyzing command structures. This thinking would eventually birth the cruiser tank concept, fast, moderately armored, designed for sweeping maneuvers. But there was another problem that needed solving. The infantry still had to advance. They still had to take and hold ground. And when they did, they'd face the same machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and field guns that had turned no man's land into an abattoir. What they needed was something that could crawl forward at walking pace, absorb punishment, and suppress enemy positions whilst soldiers moved behind it. Not a cavalry tank, an infantry tank. This wasn't a fringe idea. In 1934, the British War Office issued a specification for exactly this kind of vehicle. They wanted protection above all else. Speed, optional; range, negotiable. The tank needed to survive concentrated small arms fire, resist anti-tank rifles, and ideally shrug off field artillery. It needed to be cheap enough to produce in quantity and simple enough that conscript crews could operate it. The British designated it the Infantry Tank Mark I's, but everyone called it Matilda, allegedly because its shape reminded someone of a waddling cartoon duck from a contemporary comic strip. The Matilda I was rushed into production in 1938 as war clouds gathered. It had magnificent armor for its weight, 60 millimeters, but only a single machine gun for armament. Still, it proved the concept. When the improved Matilda II entered service in 1939, British engineers had refined the formula. They'd increased the armor to 78 millimeters on the front, added a proper turret with a 2-pounder anti-tank gun, and created something genuinely formidable. The cost? A top speed of just 15 miles per hour and appalling mechanical complexity. The Matilda II used 2 bus engines because no single power plant could move its 27 tons reliably. Meanwhile, Germany had gone a different direction entirely. Their tanks prioritized balanced characteristics: decent armor, reasonable speed, adequate firepower. The Panzer III carried 30 millimeters of frontal armor. The Panzer IV slightly more. They were built for maneuver warfare, for the combined arms tactics that would become blitzkrieg. German doctrine didn't envision slugging matches between heavily armored opponents. They planned to avoid enemy strength, exploit weakness, and move too quickly for defenders to react. Neither side fully understood what the other had built, and that misunderstanding was about to become very, very expensive. The Matilda II that rolled off production lines at Vulcan Foundry in Warrington was an engineering compromise that somehow became a masterpiece. When chief designer John Carden's team at Woolwich Arsenal began work in 1936, they faced a seemingly impossible brief: create a tank with armor thick enough to resist every anti-tank weapon then in service, keep it cheap enough for mass production, and make it mobile enough to accompany infantry. The laws of physics suggested you could have 2 of those 3. Carden's team delivered all 3, though the solution was far from elegant. The armor scheme was the heart of everything. The Matilda II's frontal protection ranged from 75 to 78 millimeters, absolutely extraordinary for 1939. To put that in context, the French Char B-1 bis, considered heavily armored, maxed out at 60 millimeters. Germany's heaviest production tank, the Panzer I-4, carried just 30 millimeters up front. The Matilda's side armor was 65 to 70 millimeters. Even the rear had 55 millimeters. This wasn't a tank with a strong front and weak flanks. It was a steel pillbox on tracks. Achieving this meant accepting brutal compromises elsewhere. The hull was cast and riveted in sections, a manufacturing technique that allowed for thick armor but limited production speed. Each tank required roughly 16,000 man-hours to complete. Vulcan Foundry, which produced the majority of Matildas, could manage perhaps 5 tanks per week at peak production. Compare that to German factories churning out dozens of Panzer IIIs monthly. Britain had quality, but Germany had quantity. The power plant solution bordered on absurd. No single engine available could reliably move 27 tons of armor at any reasonable speed. So the designers fitted 2 AEC diesel engines, originally designed for London buses, running side by side. Each produced 87 horsepower. Combined, they gave the Matilda a theoretical 174 horsepower, though mechanical losses meant actual output was lower. The power-to-weight ratio was atrocious, roughly 6.4 horsepower per ton. A Panzer III managed nearly double that. The twin-engine arrangement made maintenance a nightmare. Mechanics essentially had to service 2 separate power plants, and if one failed, the tank was immobilized. The 2-pounder gun seemed adequate in 1939. It fired a 40mm armor-piercing round capable of penetrating roughly 50 to 60 millimeters of armor at combat ranges. Against the thin-skinned Panzers of 1940, it was perfectly viable. The problem was what the 2-pounder couldn't do. It had no high-explosive round. British doctrine assumed tanks would fight tanks, whilst infantry dealt with anti-tank guns. The Matilda could kill enemy armor beautifully, but was helpless against fortified positions or infantry in buildings. Crews would discover this limitation the hard way. Inside, the 4-man crew worked in cramped, sweltering conditions. The commander sat in the turret alongside the gunner, attempting to direct the tank, coordinate with other vehicles, and command the gun simultaneously. Below, in the hull, the driver wrestled with a Wilson epicyclic gearbox, a robust but complex system requiring careful coordination. The hull gunner, often feeling rather useless given the limited traverse of his machine gun, mostly served as a second pair of eyes and an extra body for maintenance duties. The suspension was another Cardan innovation, a scissor-type arrangement with helical springs that gave a surprisingly smooth ride despite the tank's weight. 10 small road wheels per side distributed the load effectively, and the track links were robust cast manganese steel. This mattered more than it sounds. Tracks were the Achilles heel of many early war tanks, snapping under stress or shedding in turns. By September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, only 2 Matilda IIs had been delivered to the Army. Production was ramping up, but slowly. By May 1940, roughly 100 were available, not nearly enough to equip armored divisions properly, but enough to form the core of the 1st Army Tank Brigade. Those 100 tanks were about to punch well above their weight. Those 100 Matildas crossed the Channel into a catastrophe already well underway. On 10th May 1940, German forces had launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. What followed was a masterclass in mobile warfare that shattered every assumption about how modern war would be fought. Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps punched through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse at Sedan on 13th of May, and simply kept going. The French and British expected a replay of 1914, a grinding attritional struggle along fortified lines. Instead, they got a lightning war that moved faster than their command structure could process. By 20 May, German armored spearheads had reached the English Channel at Abbeville. In 10 days, they'd driven nearly 400 kilometers through supposedly impassable terrain, cut the Allied armies in two, and trapped the British Expeditionary Force against the coast. It wasn't just victory, it was humiliation. French generals issued orders to divisions that had already been encircled. British commanders received intelligence reports describing German positions that were already 50 kilometers further west. The speed of the German advance made conventional military thinking obsolete, and the tanks, the bloody tanks, were everywhere. Panzer divisions didn't attack like traditional armored formations. They bypassed strong points, ignored their flanks, and raced for strategic objectives deep in the rear. French Char B-1BS tanks were individually superior to anything Germany fielded, but they sat defending river crossings whilst German columns drove past them on roads 15 kilometers away. Superior armor meant nothing if you were in the wrong place. German tank crews had spent 2 weeks demolishing Allied armor piecemeal. They'd learned that French tanks, whilst individually formidable, operated in small packets without proper infantry or artillery support. British light tanks and cruiser tanks were faster, but carried armor you could penetrate with a decent anti-tank rifle. The Panzer III's 37mm gun and the Panzer IV's short 75mm howitzer had proven entirely adequate against everything they'd encountered. More importantly, German crews fought as combined arms teams. When they met resistance, they didn't charge in alone. They called up infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe support. Tanks were shock weapons, breakthrough weapons, but never sacrificial weapons. This success bred a particular kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Why wouldn't it? They'd accomplished in days what the Kaiser's armies couldn't manage in 4 years. German tactical radios meant their tanks could coordinate movements that would have been impossible for Allied forces still relying on flag signals and carrier pigeons in some units. Every encounter seemed to validate their training, their doctrine, their equipment. The occasional tough fight, like the brutal combat at Hanut, where French Sommewus gave better than they got, only proved that aggressive tactics and combined arms could overcome local disadvantages. By the 3rd week of May, the strategic picture was clear. The BEF was retreating towards Dunkirk. French forces were disintegrating. The campaign was essentially won. German intelligence had identified British tank units in the area, but nothing in their briefings suggested serious concern. They'd faced British armor before, light tanks with machine guns, cruiser tanks with thin protection. Fast, perhaps, but nothing that required special measures. Standard PaK-36 anti-tank guns would suffice. What intelligence hadn't told them, what they had no reason to suspect, was that a chunk of Britain's Army Tank Brigade was sitting at Arras with something German doctrine hadn't accounted for. The 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments had taken delivery of their Matildas just weeks before the invasion. Many crews were still learning the quirks of their twin-engine charges. But on 21st of May, they were going to get a very practical education. So were the Germans. The counterattack at Arras on 21st May wasn't meant to be a decisive battle. It was meant to be a spoiling attack, a jab to slow the German advance and buy time for evacuation planning. Major General Harold Franklin commanded 2 columns, one built around the 4th Royal Tank Regiment with 16 Matilda II's and 42 Matilda III variants, the other around the 7th Royal Tank Regiment with 23 Matilda II's. Supporting them were 2 infantry battalions, some French light tanks, and precious little else. No proper reconnaissance, no air support. The RAF was already evacuating from forward bases. No clear picture of what they were attacking into, just orders to strike south from Arras and see what happened. What happened was they drove straight into Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. Rommel had been pushing his division hard, living up to his reputation for aggressive leadership. His units were strung out along the advance, tanks and motorized infantry intermixed with supply trucks, and captured French vehicles pressed into service. The division had been moving fast and fighting light, exactly the kind of fluid mobile warfare that made blitzkrieg work. Around 1430 hours, as Rommel's forces were regrouping west of Arras, British tanks appeared on their flanks. The German response was textbook. Anti-tank gun crews swung their Pak-36s